The clang of the iron cage door echoed under the blazing lights of the arena, and Daniel Cormier stood at the center like a symbol of strength that the entire MMA world had learned to respect. In UFC history, very few could step into the cage with a resume as heavy as his. A former freestyle wrestling Olympian for Team USA, twice representing the nation at the Olympics, a wrestler who stood atop many international tournaments. When he entered MMA at age 30, an age when many fighters were already thinking about retirement, Daniel Cormier began writing the most glorious chapter of his life. He won the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix, defeating top fighters in the world like Josh Barnett and Antonio Silva, before stepping into the UFC and quickly becoming an undeniable force. Cormier later conquered the peak of the planet's most brutal sport by becoming the UFC light heavyweight champion, defending the belt multiple times against dangerous opponents like Anthony Johnson and Alexander Gustafsson. But the historic peak came in 2018 when he knocked out Stipe Miocic in a shocking fashion, becoming one of the very few fighters in UFC history to hold 2 championship belts in 2 different weight classes at the same time. Beyond the belts, he was honored in countless rankings of the greatest fighters, became a familiar face on ESPN as a commentator, and was called by both the locker room and fans with a simple but deeply respectful title, a true champion. But behind those gold belts, the cheers and the bright lights, was a life very few truly saw. Daniel Cormier didn't just live the life of a champion, he carried the memories of a boy who lost his father to violence when he was too young to fully understand the pain. He had to face a loss more cruel than any defeat when his newborn daughter died in a car accident, leaving a void in his heart nothing could ever fill. He spent years chasing the Olympic dream only to watch it collapse in a hospital after kidney failure from extreme weight cutting right before competition day. And even when the world saw a powerful warrior in the iron cage, few knew that every step he took carried the invisible scars of the past. For more than 20 years, Daniel Cormier lived 2 lives at once, a man the world cheered as a sports legend, and a human being quietly fighting pain, memories, and the question of whether true strength meant beating opponents or simply standing tall after everything life had taken away. If the story of strength and the pain hidden behind the spotlight of Daniel Cormier makes you think, please hit subscribe to the channel to not miss the extraordinary journeys of other legends. Louisiana, where summers always carried the heavy smell of damp earth, and small roads ran through working-class neighborhoods where people grew up faster than their years. That was where Daniel Cormier began his life, in an ordinary family, among simple houses and days when dreams seemed like a luxury for many children. His father was a hard-working, quiet man like many fathers in the American South, who believed that if you worked hard enough, the family would be okay. And Daniel at the time was just a boy, a child who still believed the world was a safe place, where evenings could end with peaceful sleep, knowing his parents would still be there when the sun rose. But there are nights when life changes forever, and for Daniel that night came too soon. One night in Louisiana, gunshots rang out in the darkness like a crack tearing through the neighborhood's peace. No one was prepared for it. No warning, no chance to say goodbye, just cold news spreading quickly through the familiar streets that Daniel Cormier's father had been shot and killed. When the police arrived, patrol cars parked in front of the house, blue and red lights spinning across the walls and windows, reflecting on the faces of neighbors standing silently in heavy quiet. To the adults, it was a tragedy. But to a child, it was the moment the whole world seemed to collapse without anyone explaining why. Daniel was too young to fully grasp the meaning of death, but old enough to realize that from that day forward, everything would never be the same again. A father no longer sat at the dinner table. A man no longer walked through the door after a long day. A void began to grow in the heart of a boy the world would later know as a champion. Daniel's mother had to carry it all. A woman standing between her own pain and the responsibility of raising children in a world that was already too harsh. She had to become stronger than her own grief, because the children in that house still needed to grow up, still needed protection from the cruel things life could bring. But no matter how much adults tried to shield them, children still feel it when the world is no longer fair. Daniel grew up with emotions many children never have to carry: anger without a clear source, simmering pain, and a quiet question of why life took away a father before he could even understand what a complete family was. At school, the boy began carrying a different energy, not senseless rebellion, but a silent anger, as if something inside him was always trying to break free. To many, Daniel was just a child growing up in tough circumstances, a familiar story in Louisiana's working-class neighborhoods. But to him, Every day was a reminder that the world wasn't always gentle with the weak, and when a child starts believing they have to protect themselves from a world like that, their childhood begins to disappear. Daniel didn't talk much about that pain when he was young, because children often don't know how to express things too big for their hearts. But those who understood him later all said that from very early on, Daniel carried an unusual intensity, a quiet determination many only develop when they're grown. Perhaps because when you lose the most important thing too soon, you start understanding that life doesn't promise anything to anyone. And it was during those years, among the ordinary streets of Louisiana, that something else was forming in Daniel Cormier. Not an instant champion, not a famous warrior, just a boy trying to find a way to stand firm in a world he no longer fully trusted. He didn't yet know he would later step into the biggest arenas in the world, didn't know millions would one day cheer his name. But what began to take shape very early was the ability to endure, the ability to get back up when life knocked him down without apology. And if there is one moment that could be said to be when Daniel Cormier's life truly began, it wasn't the day he won his first championship belt. It began on that night in Louisiana, when a child stood amid the blue and red lights of police cars and realized that from now on, he would have to grow up much faster than his age. That was the night Daniel Cormier's childhood ended. After the night that ended Daniel Cormier's childhood, the world for him was never the same again. Other kids still ran and played on the schoolyard, laughing without much thought about tomorrow. But Daniel was different. Inside him was a void no one really knew how to fill. The pain of losing his father didn't fade over time the way many adults still hope when they tell children that everything will be okay. It stayed there, quiet, heavy, like a storm that never truly passed. And for a boy who didn't yet know how to name his emotions, that pain slowly turned into the only language he understood: anger. At school, Daniel began to become the kind of student teachers had to constantly remind. Not because he was lazy or unintelligent. On the contrary, many noticed that this boy had an unusually strong energy, but it always came out in ways that were hard to control. Small arguments quickly turned into fights. Teasing that seemed harmless could make him explode. To the other kids, those were just normal teenage conflicts. But for Daniel, each one felt like a way to release something he couldn't put into words. He didn't know how to explain that he missed his dad. He didn't know how to say that some nights he still lay awake wondering why it had happened to his family. So instead of speaking, he reacted. And in the eyes of many around him, Daniel Cormier gradually became a hot-tempered boy, prone to trouble. A child carrying too much energy with no one knowing where to direct it. But life sometimes opens doors in the places people least expect. One day, Daniel stepped into the school's wrestling room, not because of some grand plan, not because he had found his dream, simply because someone said he should give it a try. And right from the first minutes on the mat, something inside Daniel began to change. Wrestling was a completely different world from the chaos he was used to. There were clear rules, boundaries, discipline. On the mat, anger no longer destroyed everything around it. It became power. Every clinch, every takedown, every drop of sweat falling to the floor carried a piece of the emotions he had held inside for so many years. And the strangest thing was that for the first time in his life, Daniel felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. In wrestling, no one asked about your past. No one cared where you came from, what your family had been through, or how much pain you carried in your heart. The only thing that mattered was whether you were ready to fight. And Daniel was ready. He trained with a focus that even the coaches noticed. Not because he wanted fame, not because he thought about medals or glory, simply because on the mat, everything became simpler. If you tried hard enough, you could win. If you trained harder than others, you could become stronger. For a boy who grew up in a world where terrible things could happen without reason, finding a place where effort truly paid off felt like finding solid ground to stand on. Wrestling gradually became Daniel's new language. Instead of fighting in school hallways, he learned to channel all his energy into practice. Instead of aimless anger, he began to learn how to control his body, his breathing, his every movement. Discipline slowly replaced chaos. The long, exhausting, sweat-soaked training sessions didn't scare him. On the contrary, they brought him a strange sense of peace. Because in every second on the mat, Daniel was no longer the boy who had lost his father. He was no longer the child carrying unexplained anger. He was just an athlete, fighting to become better than yesterday. Gradually, those around him began to notice what Daniel himself didn't fully understand at the time. He didn't just have energy, he had talent. A raw talent forged by pain and persistence. He learned quickly. He fought without backing down, and every time he stepped onto the mat, he seemed to carry the determination of someone who no longer wanted life to control him. For Daniel Cormier, wrestling wasn't just a sport. It became the only place where he felt life had rules, where the wounds in his heart could turn into strength instead of destroying him from the inside. And though no one could have imagined back then how far this path would take him, one thing became clear from those very early days: the boy who once spoke to the world through anger had now found a new language, a language written in discipline, sweat, and an unyielding will. From the day Daniel Cormier found the wrestling mat, his life began to change in ways even he couldn't fully understand at the time. At first, it was just a place to release energy, where a boy carrying too many emotions could fight without needing to explain why he was angry. But over time, those training sessions became much more. Daniel started showing up at the gym earlier than everyone else. He stayed later after every session. When the others left, Daniel remained on the mat, repeating every move, every clinch, every balance shift. The coaches quickly noticed that this boy had something very hard to teach: persistence. Not the kind of persistence that comes from ambition, but from a deep need to prove he could stand firm in a world that had knocked him down too early. And then the wins started coming. At first, small school matches, then regional tournaments. Daniel beat bigger, stronger, more experienced opponents. Every time he stepped onto the mat, he fought with a fierce focus that surprised many. He didn't just want to win. He fought as if every match was a chance to affirm that life would never knock him down again. Before long, the name Daniel Cormier began to circulate in Louisiana's wrestling circles. Coaches from other schools started noticing him. State-level tournaments became places where Daniel proved he wasn't just a hot-tempered kid who had found an outlet. He was real talent, one of the best young wrestlers in the state. But what the audience saw when Daniel won was only the surface of the story. Because every time he stood on the mat, Daniel Cormier wasn't just facing the opponent in front of him, he was also facing things no one in the arena could see. In the moment the referee signaled the start, memories of his father sometimes flashed in his mind, like a faint shadow standing somewhere in the past. Daniel never spoke much about that feeling when he was young, but those close to him later said he always carried a quiet thought: if Dad were still alive, would he be proud of me? Every win, Daniel usually didn't celebrate for long. He just stood still for a moment, breathing hard, as if that victory wasn't an end, but only a small step in a much longer journey. And then there was the fear of failure. For many young athletes, losing a match is just part of the sport, but for Daniel, failure carried a different meaning. It felt like a reminder that life could take away the most important things at any moment. After everything his family had been through, Daniel didn't want to lose anything else. That's why every match for him felt like a declaration that he would never let life defeat him again. And deep beneath all of that was the anger that had never completely disappeared. But now, that anger no longer exploded in school hallways or pointless fights. It had been forged, controlled, turned into a focused energy poured into every clinch, every movement on the mat. Coaches often said Daniel competed with an intensity rarely seen in a young athlete. He didn't give up, he didn't back down, and even when exhausted to the point of collapse, he kept fighting for a few more seconds, as if inside him there was always a voice urging that stopping wasn't an option. The high school years gradually passed with a string of victories. Daniel Cormier was no longer just the boy from an ordinary working-class family in Louisiana. He became one of the most prominent wrestlers in the state, a name that colleges began to notice. But for Daniel, those titles weren't the most important thing. What mattered was that for the first time in his life, he felt he was moving forward, not running from the past but building a future. Wrestling had given him something he didn't have before: a path, a direction, a chance to turn pain into strength. And though Daniel couldn't yet imagine back then how far this path would take him, one thing became clear in those years. The boy who once spoke to the world through anger had now learned how to fight for something bigger, a future he built with his own hands. And every time Daniel stepped onto the mat, the audience only saw a young athlete trying to win. But inside him, it was always more than that. It was a boy fighting to overcome his past, a young man trying to prove that life's losses weren't the end of the story. And every victory, no matter how small, was a step forward on the road Daniel Cormier had begun long before the world knew his name. The path Daniel Cormier began on the wrestling mats of Louisiana ultimately led him to a place the hot-tempered boy he once was never dared imagine: Oklahoma State University, one of the most prestigious wrestling programs in America. For many young athletes, Just setting foot there was already a dream, but for Daniel, it was only the starting point of a much bigger goal. The early days at Oklahoma State were anything but easy. In Louisiana, Daniel was one of the best wrestlers in the state. But here, everyone was the best from all over the country. Training sessions became more brutal. Intramural matches were sometimes more intense than official competitions. The coaches didn't care who you were before stepping into the room. The only thing they cared about was whether you were tough enough to survive in this environment. And Daniel, as he had done his whole life, refused to back down. He trained with the same fierce intensity that had pulled him out of the streets of Louisiana years earlier. Mornings started before the sun rose. Sessions stretched until his body was nearly spent. There were days Daniel returned to the dorm with muscles aching so badly he just wanted to lie down and not get up. But the next morning he was back in the room again. Because for Daniel Cormier, wrestling was no longer just a sport. It had become the only road leading to his future. And gradually those efforts began to bear fruit. Daniel became one of the standout wrestlers in the Oklahoma State program. He competed at the NCAA Division I level, facing the strongest opponents in America's college sports system. Matches demanded not just strength but intelligence, tactics, and the ability to endure crushing pressure. Daniel learned to adapt. He learned to read the match. He learned to turn his most exhausted moments into advantages. And step by step, the name Daniel Cormier started being spoken with growing respect. His NCAA accomplishments quickly caught the attention of national team coaches. National tournaments opened new doors before him. And then one day, Daniel received the invitation every young wrestler dreams of, the chance to enter the system of the United States Freestyle National Wrestling Team. It was the transition from a college athlete to an international one. Freestyle wrestling at the world level was an entirely different environment. There, Daniel faced the strongest wrestlers from Russia, Iran, Cuba, and many countries with long wrestling traditions. Matches became faster, more intense, and the smallest mistake could decide victory or defeat. But Daniel Cormier didn't back down. Instead, he began proving he could not only survive at this level, but compete with the very best. In the years that followed, he became one of America's top freestyle wrestlers in the heavyweight division. He won multiple national titles, represented the United States in international competitions, and steadily built a reputation as one of the biggest hopes in American wrestling. With every tournament, every victory, the Olympic dream grew clearer. For a wrestler, no goal was bigger than the Olympics. The Olympics weren't just a competition. They were the pinnacle of an entire career, the place where years of training, sacrifice, and pain finally had a chance to be rewarded. And Daniel Cormier began moving closer to that dream. When he earned a spot on the U.S. Olympic team, it was a moment very few people from the poor neighborhoods of Louisiana ever thought would happen. The boy who grew up amid loss and anger was now standing on the road to the biggest sports stage on the planet. Family, friends, and those who had watched his journey all believed Daniel was heading toward a bright future. The wrestling world started paying attention to him. Coaches talked about his strength and durability. Opponents knew that when they stepped onto the mat with Daniel Cormier, they would face someone who never gave up easily. Everything seemed to be going in the right direction. The path from Louisiana to Olympic glory seemed clearly laid out. But if there was one thing Daniel Cormier's life always reminded him of, it was the truth that the straightest paths sometimes hide the most painful turns. Because even though Daniel had fought for years to reach this point, life still hadn't finished its challenges for him. And very soon, he would face an event so massive that even someone accustomed to loss would struggle to prepare for it. Because the road to Olympic glory for Daniel Cormier was never an easy road. But then, just as Daniel Cormier was closer than ever to his Olympic dream, life delivered a cruel blow that no athlete could ever prepare for. It wasn't a loss on the mat. It wasn't an injury. It wasn't a failure in competition. It was a loss deeper than all of those combined. A day that Daniel would later remember forever as the moment his heart shattered. At the time, he was still very young, still building his wrestling career, still believing that all the sacrifices would lead him to the Olympics. And in his personal life, he had just become a father. His little daughter, Caden Imrie Cormier, was only a few months old, a tiny, fragile life, but one that brought Daniel a joy he had never known before. For a man who grew up with so much loss, holding his own child felt like a promise that life could still bring something good. Daniel once said that looking into his daughter's eyes gave him a kind of peace he had never truly known before. But then a fateful day arrived, and everything changed in just a few seconds. Daniel's daughter was in the car with her mother when the accident happened. The vehicle was hit hard from behind. That horrific impact took the little girl's life. When the news reached Daniel, it didn't come like a sad story. It came like a knife driven straight into his heart. There was no way to prepare for something like that. No words could soften the pain of a father hearing that his daughter was gone. In that moment, everything Daniel had fought to build seemed to lose all meaning. The medals, the tournaments, the Olympic dreams, all of it became small in the face of the brutal truth that his precious child would never grow up. Daniel collapsed. Those close to him later said that in the days that followed, he was hardly himself anymore. He spoke little. He barely ate. There were days he just sat silently in a room, staring into space as if trying to understand why life could be so cruel. There were mornings Daniel didn't leave his bed, not because his body was tired, but because his heart no longer had the strength to rise. The pain of losing a child is something very few people in the world can truly understand. It isn't like any defeat in sports. It isn't like any wound that heals with time. It is a permanent void, a question that will never have an answer. Daniel began sinking into depression. His closest friends worried as they watched him slowly withdraw from the world around him. There were days he said he no longer knew what the purpose of life was. There were days he wondered why he was still here when his daughter was not. And deep within that pain was another feeling, one many fathers who have suffered similar tragedies know: guilt. Daniel wondered if he could have done something different, if there was any way to prevent the accident, if he could have protected his daughter better. Those questions repeated endlessly in his mind, like ghosts that refused to leave. Wrestling, which had once been the place he found strength, no longer offered the same release. The mat had once helped him vent his anger, but this pain was too great to turn into fighting energy. There were moments Daniel thought he would give up everything, give up the sport, give up the dreams, even give up his own life, because when a father loses his child, the world is never the same again. The colors of life seem to fade, things that once mattered become meaningless, and Daniel Cormier, the man the world would later call a champion, had days when he didn't know if he had the strength to keep living. For many people, this tragedy could have been the end of the story, but for Daniel, even though he couldn't see it then, this was the moment his life was broken so it could later be rebuilt in a different way. Because when a person reaches the bottom of pain, they have two choices: stay there forever, or find a way to stand up, even if only in small steps. And in the darkest days of his life, Daniel Cormier began to learn how to do something nearly impossible: keep living after his heart had been shattered. But the journey of rising from that pain would not be easy at all. After losing his daughter, Daniel Cormier's life felt like a road shrouded in thick fog. No more clear goals, no more simple joy like the one he once felt holding his child in his arms. But over time, amid those long empty days, one thing remained by his side: wrestling. It was no longer about joy, no longer about dreams of glory. It was simply the only thing familiar enough to help him get out of bed each morning. Daniel returned to the gym, at first just to keep himself busy, to avoid being alone with the heavy thoughts. The first training sessions after the tragedy weren't like before. His body was still strong, but his spirit was far more fragile. There were days he trained almost without saying a word, just the sound of footsteps on the mat, heavy breathing, and memories he tried to push away whenever his mind began to wander. But day by day, wrestling once again became the thread pulling him back to life, not because it erased the pain, but because it gave him a reason to keep moving forward. And then Daniel began focusing again on the goal he had pursued for so many years: the Olympics. For a freestyle wrestler, the Games are the pinnacle of every dream. They are the place where all the sacrifices, the exhausting training sessions, the years spent away from family finally have a chance to be rewarded. Daniel had come very close to that dream before his life was shattered by personal loss, and now he wanted to return to that path, not just to win, but to prove to himself that the pain had not completely defeated him. In the years that followed, Daniel continued competing at the highest level of American wrestling. He entered selection tournaments, facing the strongest athletes in the country, and step by step he moved closer to the Olympics again. When Daniel earned his spot on the U.S. team for the '28 Beijing Olympics, many in the wrestling community believed this was his real chance to make history. He had grown more mature, stronger, and carried a determination not every athlete possesses. For Daniel, the Olympics weren't just a competition. They were an affirmation that everything he had gone through wasn't meaningless. But even as everything seemed to be heading in the right direction, life still hadn't finished its challenges for him. Wrestling at the Olympic level isn't just a battle against opponents, it's also a battle against your own body. To compete in the right weight class, athletes often have to cut weight in extreme ways, and Daniel Cormier was no exception. In the weeks before the Olympics, he began the cutting process. Training sessions became even more brutal. Water intake dropped. His body endured tremendous stress, but Daniel was used to enduring. He believed he could push through one more time, but this time, his body couldn't take it anymore. During the weight cut, Daniel started feeling his body weaken rapidly. Early signs appeared: dizziness, exhaustion, severe dehydration. But like many other athletes, he tried to continue. The Olympics were only days away. He couldn't stop. But then his body collapsed completely. Daniel suffered acute kidney failure from extreme dehydration. He was rushed to the hospital. When he woke up in the hospital room, he heard doctors say something no Olympic athlete ever wants to hear. He couldn't compete. No match. No chance. No Olympic dream. Daniel Cormier was forced to withdraw from the 28 Beijing Olympics before ever stepping onto the mat. To many on the outside, it was just sports news. An athlete had health issues and had to pull out. But for Daniel, it was another blow to a heart already wounded too many times. The dream he had chased through his entire youth shattered just days before it had a chance to become real. He lay in the hospital, staring at the ceiling, and once again felt that familiar feeling life had brought him so many times, the feeling that everything he had worked to build could collapse in a single moment. For many athletes, that might have been the end of a career, an Olympic dream broken, a body exhausted, a heart too tired after years of battling loss. And in the days after leaving Beijing without competing, Daniel Cormier began asking a question he had never had to face so clearly before: if the Olympics are gone, then where does my life go? But sometimes, when doors close, that's exactly how life opens a completely new path. And Daniel Cormier, even though he didn't know it yet, was standing at the threshold of a different journey. A journey that would take him to an arena even more brutal than the Olympics. An arena where every pain, every failure, every memory from the past would be transformed into his most powerful weapon. After leaving Beijing without stepping onto the mat even once, Daniel Cormier returned to the United States with an emptiness that was hard to describe. For many years, his life had been built around one single goal: the Olympics. Every morning waking up, every training session pushed to exhaustion, every tournament he entered was a small step toward that dream. But now, that dream had shattered. No medal, no moment standing on the podium, no affirmation that all the sacrifices of his youth had been rewarded. When the Olympic lights went out, Daniel had to face a question many athletes dread after their careers end: if there's no more sports, then who am I? The days after the Olympics passed slowly. Daniel still went to the gym, but everything felt different. Before, every session had a clear purpose. Now he trained like an old habit that hadn't yet faded. No big tournaments ahead, no clear path leading forward. At age 30, an age when many freestyle wrestlers were starting to think about retirement, Daniel stood at a crossroads in life, feeling like he had reached the end of the road. He had lost his daughter, he had lost his Olympic dream, and now, he wasn't sure if he had anything left to fight for. But life sometimes changes direction in the most unexpected ways. At the American Kickboxing Academy in San Jose, where Daniel occasionally trained with other athletes, he began spending more time around a sport he had only known from afar before: mixed martial arts, MMA. To many people, MMA is a brutal world, a place where fighters step into an iron cage and battle using every skill they have, from punches and kicks to wrestling and submissions. It's not a sport for those who want an easy life. But when Daniel looked at the cage, he realized something few could understand at that moment. He no longer feared challenges the way he once did. Because when someone has lost so much in life, the fear of failure starts to feel small. For Daniel Cormier at that time, MMA wasn't a new dream. It was simply an opportunity. An opportunity to start over when everything else had collapsed. An opportunity to use everything he had learned from wrestling in a different arena. And perhaps most importantly, an opportunity to keep fighting. Those around him weren't initially sure if this was a wise decision. MMA is a punishing sport, where younger, faster fighters who have trained for years are waiting. Daniel was 30 then, an age many thought was too late to start a new career. But Daniel had never lived his life according to numbers other people set. He began training seriously. The first striking sessions weren't easy. Wrestling gave him an excellent foundation in grappling, but MMA demanded much more. He had to learn how to punch, how to defend against kicks, how to fight in a cage instead of on a mat. There were sessions where Daniel felt like a complete beginner, but instead of getting discouraged, it fueled his determination, because starting over from the beginning was something Daniel Cormier had done before, and every time life forced him to rise from the ruins, he found a way to keep going. What impressed many coaches at AKA wasn't just Daniel's elite wrestling skills. What struck them was his spirit. Daniel trained with the focus of a man who knew he no longer had time to waste. Every session carried an urgency, as if he understood this might be his last chance to rebuild his life. And over time, those around him began to realize what Daniel himself hadn't yet dared to believe. He could become a real MMA fighter, not just a former wrestler trying his luck in a new sport, but a legitimate threat. For Daniel Cormier, stepping into MMA wasn't a decision filled with confidence. It was like jumping into the unknown, where he didn't know for sure where he would land. But perhaps that was exactly what made him ready to do it. Because after everything life had taken from him, Daniel felt he had nothing left to lose. No Olympic medal, no clear road ahead, no perfect plan for the future. Just a 30-year-old man standing before an iron cage, ready to start again in a brutal sport. But sometimes, the people who step into battle feeling they have nothing left to lose are the most dangerous ones. Daniel Cormier stepped into the world of MMA with the mindset of a man who had nothing left to lose, but very quickly the entire world began to realize that the man from Louisiana was not just a newcomer testing his luck in a new sport. He brought something very few fighters could learn: an elite wrestling foundation and a spirit forged through far too much pain in life. His first fights took place in small promotions, in front of audiences who didn't yet know his name. But right from the first minutes inside the iron cage, one thing was very clear. Daniel Cormier didn't fight like someone trying his luck. He fought like a man who had waited for this moment his entire life. His wrestling dominated. His physical strength made opponents struggle to resist. But what made Daniel the most dangerous wasn't just technique, it was his fighting pace. When the fight began, Daniel advanced with relentless pressure, like a wave that never stops. The early wins came fast, and then his reputation began to spread. Not long after, Daniel signed with Strikeforce, one of the biggest MMA organizations in the world at the time. This was a place filled with top heavyweights and light heavyweights who had been fighting for years with deep experience in the cage. For a fighter starting MMA at age 30, this was a massive challenge. But Daniel Cormier had never chosen the easy path. When Strikeforce organized the Heavyweight Grand Prix, a tournament bringing together the strongest heavyweights in the organization, few thought Daniel would become the central figure of the story. He wasn't the most famous name, he wasn't the one getting the most media attention, but sometimes the most dangerous warriors are the ones the world hasn't yet noticed. In the tournament's semifinal, Daniel faced Antonio Bigfoot Silva, a giant fighter with terrifying power and many years of MMA experience. Before the fight, many believed this would be too big a challenge for Daniel. Silva was taller, heavier, and used to fighting on big stages. But when the iron cage door closed, Daniel Cormier showed that experience sometimes can't replace will. Right from the first minutes, Daniel imposed his game with wrestling. He repeatedly took Silva down, controlling the fight with astonishing calm. But what surprised the audience most was his striking. Daniel's punches were powerful and precise, gradually breaking down his opponent's defense. And then the decisive moment came. Daniel unleashed a furious series of punches that dropped Silva. The referee was forced to stop the fight. Antonio Silva, one of the most feared heavyweights at the time, had been defeated. The audience began to realize this man wasn't just a short-lived surprise story. Daniel Cormier was a real threat, but the biggest challenge still lay ahead. In the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix final, Daniel faced Josh Barnett, an MMA legend, former UFC champion, and one of the world's most dangerous grapplers. Barnett had vast experience, elite submission technique, and the composure of a fighter who had been in countless big fights. Before the fight, many experts believed Barnett would stop Daniel. But once again, Daniel stepped into the cage with the spirit life had forged in him over the years. The fight was intense, every minute a battle of minds between two fighters with outstanding grappling foundations. Barnett tried to pull Daniel into dangerous submission positions, but Daniel always found a way to escape. He used strength, speed, and patience to control the fight. Round after round, it became clear Daniel was gaining the upper hand. When the fight ended, the judges unanimously awarded the win to Daniel Cormier. The man who began his MMA career at age 30 had defeated a legend to become the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix champion. That moment wasn't just a sports victory, it was a symbol of Daniel's journey. From a man who once thought his life had ended after the Olympics, he now stood in the cage holding the championship trophy. The crowd rose to their feet applauding. Commentators called it one of the most incredible stories in MMA. From a fighter who started late, Daniel Cormier had quickly become one of the most dangerous fighters in the world. But if you look deeper, that victory carried another meaning. It wasn't just a story about talent. It was a story about a man who had gone through far too much loss but still found a way to rise. In the Strikeforce cage, Daniel Cormier wasn't just fighting the opponents in front of him. He was fighting all the memories, failures and pain life had placed on his shoulders. And for the first time in many years, the world began to see what Daniel had quietly proven his entire life. Sometimes the strongest warriors aren't the ones who have never fallen, but the ones who have fallen many times and still stand up to keep fighting. But Daniel Cormier's journey was far from over, because ahead of him lay a much bigger arena, a place where the world's best fighters were waiting. And there, Daniel would face even more dangerous opponents, even more brutal battles, and a competition that could define his entire legacy. The victory at the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix turned Daniel Cormier from a late-blooming rookie into one of the most formidable fighters in the world. But MMA, like his life, never allowed things to stay simple. After Strikeforce shut down and many fighters transitioned to the UFC, Daniel stepped into the biggest stage in MMA, the place where the planet's best fighters competed, and where every win or loss was watched by the entire world. Daniel quickly continued his winning streak. He defeated strong opponents, proving that his success in Strikeforce wasn't luck. But the higher he climbed in the UFC rankings, the closer he came to a name almost every light heavyweight fighter had to face if they wanted to become champion: Jon Jones. Jon Jones at that time was already a phenomenon in MMA. Younger than Daniel, taller, with longer reach, and possessing a fighting style almost no one could imitate. Many called Jones the greatest talent the light heavyweight division had ever seen. And when the UFC began building a fight between Jones and Cormier, the media quickly realized this wasn't just a sports matchup. It was a tense confrontation between two completely different men. Daniel Cormier entered MMA from pain, from failures, from a long journey of endurance. Jon Jones entered MMA as a young genius who seemed to win naturally. That difference quickly turned into tension. Press conferences between the two became heated. The back and forth wasn't just fight promotion anymore. There were moments when the hostility between them felt very real. Daniel, usually known for his calm and humor, grew sharp whenever he spoke about Jones, and Jones didn't hesitate to fire back. The media pressure grew enormous. Fans split into two sides. One backed Jon Jones, the dominant champion. The other stood with Daniel Cormier, the man who had gone through so much pain to reach this point. When their first fight finally took place at UFC 182 in 2015, the entire MMA world watched. Daniel stepped into the cage with a determination few doubted. This wasn't just a chance to win the UFC title. For him, it was a chance to prove that everything he had endured, losing his daughter, Olympic failure, starting over from scratch, had meaning. The early rounds were suffocatingly tense. Daniel tried to close distance, using wrestling to control Jones. But Jon Jones showed why he was considered one of the most talented fighters in history. With his long reach and unique striking, Jones constantly created problems for Daniel. The fight went the full 5 rounds. Daniel fought to the end, never backing down, but when the final bell rang, the judges awarded the win to Jon Jones. Daniel Cormier had lost. In that moment, he stood in the cage, sweat and blood mixing, eyes heavy, not because he had been defeated in a fight, but because he had placed so much hope in this battle. After the fight, Daniel tried to stay composed in front of the media, but there were moments when his real emotions couldn't be hidden. Those close to the cage that night remembered Daniel standing silently for several long seconds, as if trying to accept a truth his heart wasn't ready to face. But the story between Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones wasn't over. In the years that followed, their paths continued to intertwine in dramatic ways. When Jon Jones got caught up in issues outside the cage and was stripped of the title, Daniel finally got his chance to claim the light heavyweight belt. He defeated Anthony Johnson to become UFC champion. That was the moment many thought Daniel had finally reached the top. But deep in his heart, something still felt unfinished. Jon Jones. Their second matchup was scheduled for UFC 214 in 2017. The pressure this time was even greater. Daniel was the champion. Jones was returning to reclaim a title he had never lost in the cage. Throughout the promotion, Daniel's emotions became clearer than ever. In one interview, he even broke down in tears when talking about the pressure and the hatred he felt toward Jones. It was no longer just a sports rivalry, it was a personal war. When the two stepped into the cage for the second time, the atmosphere in the arena was explosive. The fight was tense, with fierce exchanges. Daniel fought with everything he had, but then the fateful moment came. Jon Jones landed a perfect head kick. Daniel staggered. Jones rushed in to finish with a flurry of strikes. The referee was forced to stop the fight. Daniel Cormier went down in the cage. After the fight, as he sat on the canvas, tears streamed down his face. Those weren't the tears of a fighter who had just lost a match. Those were the tears of a man who had fought his entire life to overcome adversity, but in the biggest battle of his career, he still couldn't win. That moment became one of the most heartbreaking images in UFC history. A champion, a man who had overcome so much loss, sitting quietly in the cage with a broken heart. But if there is one thing Daniel Cormier's life has always proven, it is that his story never ends with the defeats. Because sometimes the fights we lose are the ones that shape who we become. And Daniel Cormier still had one more chapter in his story. A chapter where he would find another way to become a champion. Not by defeating Jon Jones, but by proving that a person's greatness isn't measured only by wins. After the battles with Jon Jones, many thought Daniel Cormier's story in the UFC had reached its limit. He had become the light heavyweight champion, but Jones's shadow always lingered behind every victory. For many fighters, 2 losses to the same opponent could have been the end of bigger ambitions. But Daniel Cormier was never the type to let his life be defined by moments of falling. Instead of dwelling in disappointment, Daniel made a bold decision. He would move up to heavyweight. It wasn't an easy choice. The UFC heavyweight division was where punches could end a fight in a single second, and at the top of that division at the time stood a name the entire MMA world respected, Stipe Miocic. Miocic wasn't just the champion, he was the most successful heavyweight in UFC history up to that point, having defended the belt multiple times and defeated a long list of dangerous opponents. To many experts, the fight between Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic at UFC 226 in 2018 felt more like a daring experiment than a real winning plan. Daniel was shorter, smaller, and entering the weight class near age 40. But if there was one thing Daniel Cormier's life had always taught him, it was to never let others decide his limits. When UFC 226 night arrived, the atmosphere in the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas was tense and full of anticipation. Daniel stepped into the cage with the light heavyweight belt on his shoulder. If he won, he would become one of the very few fighters in UFC history to hold 2 championship belts at the same time. But standing before him was Stipe Miocic, a heavyweight champion with power that could finish any fight at any moment. When the fight began, both fighters were cautious. Miocic used his height and reach to throw jabs. Daniel kept moving, looking for distance to close in. The crowd knew that one small mistake could end the fight instantly. Then the fateful moment came faster than anyone imagined. In a close-range exchange, Daniel suddenly threw a short but extremely precise right hand. The punch landed clean on Miocic's chin. The heavyweight champion staggered. Daniel immediately rushed in with a flurry of follow-up strikes. Just seconds later, Stipe Miocic went down. The referee was forced to stop the fight. The arena erupted. Daniel Cormier had knocked out the UFC heavyweight champion in the first round. In that moment, history happened. Daniel Cormier became a UFC double champion, the champion of 2 weight classes at once. As the heavyweight belt was placed on his shoulder, Daniel stood in the cage with 2 gold belts in his hands. The lights shone down, the crowd roared. Commentators called it one of the greatest moments in UFC history. A man who began his MMA career at age 30 now stood at the top of the world. But if you looked closely at Daniel's face in that moment, you saw something else. Joy. Yes, pride. Undeniable. But beneath it all was a very characteristic stillness of Daniel Cormier. Because he knew that the biggest wins in life don't erase the past. When Daniel held the 2 belts in his hands, he wasn't just thinking about the fight that had just ended. He was thinking about the long journey that brought him here. About the boy in Louisiana who lost his father when he was young. About the young man who once stood before an empty crib after losing his daughter. About the Olympic athlete who lay in a hospital when his Olympic dream collapsed. And about the moments he sat in the cage, tears streaming down after losses to Jon Jones. All those memories were still there. The old wounds didn't disappear just because of a victory. But perhaps that was exactly why the moment at UFC 226 was so special. Daniel Cormier didn't become champion because his life was easy. He became champion because he survived things that could have made many others fall forever. When Daniel raised the two belts high in front of thousands of fans, it wasn't just a fighter's victory in a match. It was a victory of a man over everything life had ever thrown at him. But even as he stood at the top of the world that night, Daniel Cormier still understood a truth that only those who have endured much loss truly know. Victory can bring glory, but it doesn't erase the scars. And sometimes those very scars are what remind a man why he fought his whole life. After the glorious night at UFC 226, when Daniel Cormier stood in the center of the cage with two championship belts on his shoulders, many believed his story had reached its most brilliant chapter. A man who started his MMA career at age 30 had now reached the pinnacle of the world's most brutal sport. But the lights of victory often hide a truth only fighters truly understand. No one walks out of the fight without paying a price. And Daniel Cormier's body had begun sending clear signals that the price was arriving. The years of competing at the highest level had accumulated on every joint, every muscle. Daniel's back often ached after heavy training sessions. The takedowns, the hard slams to the mat in wrestling and MMA, had left their marks. There were mornings he woke up and needed several minutes just to stand straight. Not because he had grown weaker, but because his body had been through too many years of fighting. His knees also started reacting after every training camp. Movements that were once quick and light now sometimes came with stiffness. Doctors said it was almost inevitable for an athlete who had competed for decades. But for Daniel, every pain was a reminder that time was slowly catching up to him. And then there were his hands, the hands that had thrown thousands of punches in the cage. The knuckles swelled after every fight. The wrapping sessions lasted weeks after brutal training camps. Fighters often joke that their hands feel like rocks after years of fighting. But the truth is that beneath the tape and gloves are small wounds that build up over time. Daniel Cormier's body didn't collapse in a single day. It was like a building that had endured too many storms. Each passing year added another small crack, a new injury, a part of the body that no longer recovered as quickly. But perhaps the harshest challenge Daniel had to face wasn't just the injuries. It was the weight-cutting process, the ordeal every MMA fighter goes through before each fight. For many years Daniel fought at light heavyweight, 205 pounds, a weight class that required him to cut a significant amount from his natural weight. The weeks before every fight were a period when his body endured extreme stress. Water intake dropped, diet tightened to the gram, training sessions in hot rooms where fighters tried to sweat out the final few pounds before weigh-ins. It was a process most outsiders never see. And for Daniel, who had once suffered kidney failure from extreme weight cutting before the Olympics, it was always a dangerous challenge. There were times after weighing in when he was nearly exhausted, his body dehydrated, his mind spinning. But just hours later, he still had to step into the cage in front of millions of viewers. Fans only saw a powerful champion walking out to fight. They didn't see the hours before when his body was nearly drained of energy. The years of fighting had taken so much from Daniel Cormier, not just sweat or bruises. It took away the simple comfort of a healthy body. It took away mornings waking up without aches. And it took away a portion of his youth. But what was astonishing was that Daniel rarely complained about it. In interviews he often smiled and said it was just part of the game, a price every fighter pays if they want to reach the top. But those close to him knew his body was gradually sending a clear message. No one can fight forever. No one can keep stepping into the cage year after year without feeling the consequences. And Daniel, the man who had fought his entire life, began to understand that the moment to make the biggest decision of his career was approaching. Because sometimes the hardest challenge for a warrior isn't beating the opponent in front of them. It's accepting that their body has fought long enough. And very soon Daniel Cormier would face the final battle of his career. A battle not just to defend a title, but to close the journey of one of the greatest warriors in MMA history. But if you only look at the fights inside the iron cage, people will only see one part of Daniel Cormier. The world sees a champion, a fighter with terrifying power, a man ready to step into brutal battles in front of millions of viewers. However, there is another Daniel Cormier that very few people outside the real martial arts world truly understand. A completely different person when he steps away from the lights of the arena. Outside the cage, Daniel is not a warrior. He is a father, a husband, a teacher. After all the losses that life has brought him, family becomes the most important thing to Daniel. When he comes home after long training camps, He is no longer the UFC champion, he is simply Dad. The man who once fought in front of thousands of spectators now spends afternoons playing with his kids, taking them to school, or sitting watching them practice sports. Daniel once said that being a father is what has made him understand the meaning of life the most clearly. After the tragedy of losing his daughter years ago, every moment with his family has become so much more precious, and that is exactly what has helped him maintain balance in a career full of pressure. Besides family, there is another place where Daniel spends a tremendous amount of time: the gym. American Kickboxing Academy in San Jose is not just where he trains, it is like a second family. In the sweat-filled room with the sounds of gloves colliding, Daniel is not just a fighter, he is a guide. Young fighters who step into the gym quickly realize that Daniel Cormier is not only a champion with an impressive record, he is someone always ready to help, share experience, and encourage them when they face difficulties. There are training sessions where Daniel spends more time coaching others than training himself. He corrects every small detail in wrestling technique, shows them how to maintain balance, how to move in the cage, and more importantly, he teaches them how to stay mentally strong when things get tough. Among those who have trained with Daniel are many big names in MMA. Khabib Nurmagomedov, the undefeated UFC lightweight champion, has said many times that Daniel is like an older brother in the gym. The two share a strong wrestling foundation and deep respect for the sport. During sparring sessions, they often push each other to the limit, but outside the gym, they joke and laugh like close friends. Cain Velasquez, former UFC heavyweight champion, is also an important part of Daniel's journey. The two are not just teammates but true brothers. They trained together for many years, shared victories and defeats, and supported each other through the tough phases of their careers. Anyone who has stepped into AKA knows that Daniel Cormier has a special role in the gym. When the atmosphere gets tense before big fights, he is often the one bringing positive energy. He talks, jokes, makes everyone feel more at ease. But when training starts, he is also the most serious. Daniel believes the gym is where champions are forged, and because of that, he always demands absolute discipline from himself as well as from those around him. The young fighters often call him by one simple word: leader. Not because he demands it, but because of the way he acts. People naturally look to him as a leader. A leader is not always the strongest person in the room. It is the one ready to help others become better. Daniel Cormier understands that more than anyone, because he himself was once a young fighter stepping into the gym with many questions and very few answers. And now, after many years fighting at the top, he wants to be the one helping the next generation find their path faster. When you see Daniel in the gym, you see a very different image from the fighter in the cage. No roaring crowds, no bright lights, just a man in a training shirt, soaked in sweat, patiently guiding a young fighter on how to execute a proper wrestling move. Perhaps that is the Daniel Cormier the world rarely sees. Not the two-division champion, not the man who fought in historic battles, but a person using his experience and heart to help others become stronger. And in some ways, that role may be even more important than the championship belts he once won, because belts can be passed to others when a champion retires. But the influence of a teacher, a leader, can last long after the final bell of a career has rung. But even the greatest warriors eventually reach a point where they must make the hardest decision in their career: leaving the cage. For Daniel Cormier, that decision did not come in a single moment. It came slowly, through the years, as his body began reminding him that the battles had gone on too long. The injuries to his back, knees, and hands no longer healed quickly like before. Training camps became heavier, and deep down, Daniel knew that one day he would have to step out of the place that had shaped his entire life. His final fight took place in 2020, when he faced Stipe Miocic for the third time. It was not just a fight. It was like the final chapter of a journey spanning decades. Two men stepped into the cage with deep respect for each other, but they also understood that this might be the last time they stood on such a big stage. Daniel fought as he always had throughout his career: strong, resilient, never backing down. But when the fight ended and the belt no longer belonged to him, Daniel did not react like someone who had lost everything. Instead, he stood in the middle of the cage, took a deep breath, and seemed to accept a truth he had felt for a long time. His time in the iron cage was over. No angry shouting, no promises to come back for revenge, just a man standing quietly under the lights, understanding that his journey as a fighter had reached its end. After many years of fighting, Daniel Cormier officially retired, And when he stepped out of the cage for the last time, the MMA world knew they had just witnessed the closing of one of the most special careers in the history of the sport. But Daniel Cormier's life has never been only about fighting. And so, when the fighter chapter closed, a new chapter quickly began. Daniel stepped into a role few thought he would excel at so well: commentator. Sitting cage's side, with headphones and a microphone, Daniel became one of the most familiar voices in the UFC. What makes him special is not just his expertise, it is the way he tells the story of the fights. Daniel understands what fighters feel when stepping into the cage. He understands the anxiety in the locker room. He understands the pressure when the whole world is watching you. And so every time he analyzes a fight, the audience does not just hear technical commentary, they hear the story of someone who has been in that exact position. Daniel's voice carries sincerity, and sometimes his familiar humor. Fans quickly loved his commentary because they know this man is not just talking about martial arts. He has lived it his entire life. But commentating is only part of Daniel's new chapter. He also became a coach, continuing to spend time in the gym to help the young generation of fighters develop. Everything he learned through years of fighting, from wrestling, MMA tactics, to handling pressure, is now passed on to those who come after. In training sessions, Daniel still brings his familiar energy. He guides, corrects technique, encourages young fighters when they struggle, but most importantly, he teaches them how to become strong people, not just good fighters, because Daniel understands better than anyone that a martial arts career is not just about wins in the cage, it is the journey of a person learning to face failure, loss, and pressure. And perhaps the most interesting role Daniel found after retiring is as a storyteller. In TV shows, podcasts, or interviews, Daniel often recounts stories from his journey. Stories about the gym, memories of big fights, lessons he learned through years of fighting. When Daniel tells stories, people can see another side of him: thoughtful, reflective, sometimes humorous, but always sincere. He does not try to paint his past as a perfect story. Instead, he talks about the failures, the mistakes, and the painful moments that shaped who he is. And perhaps that is what makes Daniel Cormier's story so special. Because he is not just a champion, he is a man who has lived through very different chapters of life. From a boy who lost his father in Louisiana, to an Olympic athlete with a broken dream, to an MMA fighter starting his career at age 30, and finally a two-division UFC champion. When Daniel stepped out of the cage for the last time, the stage lights did not go out, they just shifted position. Instead of shining on a fighter in battle, they now shine on a man telling his story and helping others write theirs. And in some ways, that may be the most meaningful chapter in Daniel Cormier's life. And then, when all the fights had faded into the past, when the iron cage no longer closed behind him, the biggest question of this story finally became clear. Daniel Cormier lived 2 lives for 2 decades, but not in the way many people imagine. No dark secrets, no hidden scandals, no second life concealed from the lights. Daniel Cormier's 2 lives were much simpler, but also much more painful. One life was what the world saw: the two-division UFC champion, the Olympic athlete, the Strikeforce Grand Prix winner, the man standing in the cage with 2 gold belts on his shoulders, amid thousands of fans screaming under blinding lights. That was the image the whole world remembered. A powerful warrior, an opponent who never backed down, a man many believed had conquered every challenge life threw at him. But Daniel Cormier's second life existed in places the lights never reached. It was the boy in Louisiana, standing silently in the night, when his father was shot and killed. A child who hadn't yet understood the world, had to learn just how cruel life could be. It was the young man carrying anger and pain to the wrestling room, where for the first time he learned to turn the chaos inside into discipline. It was the young father standing in front of news no one in the world wants to hear. His newborn daughter was gone forever after a car accident, a moment when his heart nearly shattered into pieces. It was the Olympic athlete lying in a hospital in Beijing, hearing the doctor say his body had broken down and his lifelong dream would never come true. And it was the MMA fighter sitting in the cage after losing to Jon Jones, tears streaming down while the whole world watched. Those 2 lives always existed side by side. One life was victory, titles, and glory. The other was loss, failure, and wounds very few truly knew about. But what makes Daniel Cormier's story special isn't that he had 2 lives like that. Many people in this world live with pains others never see. What sets Daniel apart is how he carried those wounds and still kept moving forward. He never pretended his life was perfect. He didn't hide his failures. He talked about them. He admitted there were days he didn't want to get out of bed, days he doubted himself. But every time Daniel did something very few can do when life gets too heavy. He stood back up, not because he didn't feel the pain, but because he understood that stopping wasn't an option, and over time those hardest moments shaped the man the world later came to know. A boy who lost his father, learned to become a strong man for his family. A father who lost his child, learned to cherish every moment with the loved ones still here. An Olympic athlete who failed, found another path to become a champion. A fighter who battled through pain, became a symbol of resilience in a brutal sport. When people look at Daniel Cormier's record, they see the titles: UFC champion, Strikeforce champion, Olympian, one of the greatest fighters in MMA history. But if you look a little deeper, the real story of Daniel Cormier isn't in the gold belts or the win numbers. It's in his ability to survive the storms life threw at him. Because true greatness is rarely built in easy moments. It's built in the days when a person feels like they can't go on, in the long nights when the pain won't leave, in the failures that make everything around them seem to collapse. And every time Daniel Cormier chose to stand up one more time. Maybe that's why so many young fighters in the gym call him a leader. Not because he has the most titles, but because they know this man has been through things many can't even imagine and still kept his heart. Today, Daniel Cormier no longer steps into the cage. He sits outside with a microphone, calling the fights of the new generation. He stands in the gym, guiding young fighters on how to get stronger. And when he looks at them, maybe he sees a piece of his past self. A young person trying to find their way through life's hardships. And if Daniel Cormier's story can teach us one thing, it's this: a person's greatest victory isn't beating every opponent in front of them. The greatest victory is continuing to walk after life has tried to knock you down. Because greatness isn't built from easy wins, it is built from the storms a man survives. Greatness is not built in easy victories, it is built in the storms a man survives. The story of Daniel Cormier makes it impossible to see him merely as a martial arts champion. When looking back at the entire journey we just walked through, what lingers most deeply isn't the 2 UFC belts or the victory at Strikeforce Grand Prix, but the painful path he had to walk to become that man. A boy in Louisiana who lost his father to gun violence when he was too young, standing amid police car lights without understanding why the world was so cruel. Many years later, when life seemed to start smiling, he faced the greatest tragedy any father can endure: the death of his newborn daughter in a car accident. That was a wound no later victory in the cage could erase. Then came the Olympic dream shattered when his body failed with kidney collapse right before Beijing 2008, a moment any athlete could completely collapse from. Yet Daniel Cormier didn't stop there. At age 30, when many wrestlers were ending their careers, he started over from the beginning with MMA and ultimately stood at the top of the world at UFC 226 by knocking out Stipe Miocic to become double champion. That wasn't just a sports victory, it was a victory of a man who had gone through far too much loss. For Americans, Daniel Cormier's story reminds us of something very important in American culture. True strength isn't never falling down, but being able to stand up after tragedies that seem impossible to overcome. In a society where many people face loss, pressure, and personal failure, his journey shows that adversity doesn't have to destroy a person. Sometimes the deepest wounds create the strongest people. If the story of Daniel Cormier's journey, full of loss but also full of resilience, makes you reflect, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a heart emoji as a tribute to the man who turned pain into strength. Thank you for listening to this story, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the extraordinary lives hidden behind the spotlight of legends.